All right, welcome everybody. In this course, we'll be using Davinci Resolve. Now you can follow along with the same techniques in Adobe Premiere or Apple Final Cut, but just remember that the buttons and features will be in different places. So the first thing we want to do is import our footage into Davinci Resolve. So you're going to navigate to where your footage is stored. I'm going to go ahead and double click on the folder that I've downloaded here and drag all of the media into the media pool. We're going to click on Don't Change. And now our media is imported. Before we start with the color correction and color grading, it's important to understand how Davinci Resolve works. Right now, by default, we're opened up into the Cut page. Over here, we've got our Edit tab. And here we've got our Fusion tab, which is where we do our visual effects work. And then right here, we've got our color page. What I'm going to do is click on the Edit tab, and I'm going to select all of my media and I'm going to drag it onto the timeline. Now coming over to the color tab, we have all of our color grading controls, and this is where things get a little bit complicated, but I'm going to go ahead and simplify this. So the first thing we want to do is understand this layout. We're going to go ahead and first start with our node structure. Up here, this is where we have our nodes. This box represents the original image. This box over here represents the final output of the image. Every node that we add on this chain in between these two boxes are adjustments that we're making to the image. This box right here, or this node, contains any effects that we make on it. And then we can create more nodes and add more effects at different steps along the color correction and color grading path. Now, this is important because each step affects the one after it. So if we desaturate the image first, and then in the next node, we try to add saturation back in, it's using the information from the previous node. I'll give you a practical example. So I'm going to go ahead and desaturate this image. I'm going to create a new node by pressing Option S on my keyboard, or Alt S if you're on Windows. Now we've desaturated this node. On this node, if we try to add saturation back in, it's using the information that this node gave it, and there's nothing to saturate. It's all still monochrome. So this is an example of why node structure is important and order of operations are crucial for color correction and color grading. I'm going to go ahead and reset this. Now down here on the bottom is where we have all of our color correction and grading controls. By default, we are opened up to our primaries color wheels and our custom RGB curves. And then we also have our keyframes down here. Over here, we've got our primary color wheels. These are very broad adjustments, and we've got our offset, our gain, gamma, and lift. Our lift controls the darkest parts of our image. Gamma is right in the middle, and our gain is our highlights. And then our offset is the image as a whole. So if I drag the offset to the right, we're brightening the entire image. If I drag it to the left, we're darkening the entire image. I'm going to go ahead and click this to reset it. And then with our lift, we can brighten or darken our shadows, and then same with the gamma and gain. Now, while these are broad adjustments, if we move over into our log wheels right here, these are more targeted, more specific adjustments. So I'm gonna go ahead and raise the midtones. You can see this is pretty targeted and specific. We're not reaching any of these highlights or into any of these shadows. I'm gonna go ahead and reset it. And if we come back to our primaries wheels, if we try to raise the gamma, we're influencing all the other tonal ranges in the image. So just remember that our primary color wheels are broad adjustments and our log wheels are much more targeted adjustments. Now, if the log wheels are still not targeted enough, you can move over into the HDR wheels, which are even more targeted and separate the image into even more tonal ranges. So we've got our specular highlights, our lights, then we've got our shadows, darks, and blacks. And then of course we have our global controls right here. Let's go back to our primary color wheels. Now with our color wheel controls, we also have our temperature, our tint, contrast, pivot, mid-tone detail, color boost, shadows, highlight, saturation, hue, and luma mix. We're only going to be focusing on a couple of these. With our temperature, we can drag to the left to introduce more blue, or drag to the right to make the image a lot warmer. This is for when our white balance is incorrect and we need to warm up or cool off the image. I'm going to go ahead and reset this. Our tint, we can introduce more green or magenta depending on the tint of the lighting in our image. I'm gonna go ahead and reset this again. Our contrast pretty straightforwardly just increases or decreases contrast in the image, and then our pivot controls where the contrast originates from. So we can choose to have the contrast originate from the shadows or from the highlights, and I'm gonna go ahead and reset both of these. And then of course we have our saturation and hue down here, and then our color boost is similar to vibrance. It saturates some of the less saturated parts of the image. And our custom curves, these are our RGB curves. We have more control over the contrast that we create in our RGB curves. Up here we've got our highlights, down here we've got our shadows, our black point, and our white point. If we create an S, we're dragging our highlights up and our shadows down, we're creating contrast. I'm gonna go ahead and reset this. Now under our hue versus hue curves, we can change the hue based on the hue of the image. So we can see that we've got some blues here in the image. I'm gonna go ahead and create a point here, and then drag up or down to change the hue of the blue colors in the image. And we can do this with any of the colors. We're changing the hue based on the hue of the image. I'll go ahead and reset this. And then we come to our hue versus saturation. Basically the same thing, just instead of adjusting the hue, we're adjusting the saturation of specific colors within the image. So we can go ahead and saturate those blues or desaturate them, whichever you'd like. Go ahead and reset that. Then we've got our hue versus luma. We can go ahead and brighten or darken colors within the image. And then we have our luma versus saturation, where we can saturate the image based on the brightness. So if we want, we can go ahead and saturate the brighter areas and desaturate the darker areas, or vice versa. I'm gonna go ahead and reset this. Then we have our saturation versus saturation, where we can saturate the less saturated parts of the image or desaturate them, or saturate or desaturate the more saturated parts of the image. And then under our sat versus lume, we can control the brightness based on the saturation of the image. We'll come back to our custom curves, and then we're gonna move on to the color warper. This is where we can control, again, some of the hue and saturation within the image. We're not going to get too in depth into this, but basically anything toward the center is less saturated, anything toward the edges is more saturated, and this little glob in the middle kind of tells you where the colors are at in your image. We can go ahead and drag left or right to adjust the position of the colors. So we're adjusting the skin tones, make them more yellow or green, or making them more red or pink. We're going to go ahead and reset that. And if we want to saturate the less saturated parts, we can drag these little points up toward the edges, and then we're not actually increasing the saturation on the edge, we're just taking the less saturated parts and bringing them closer to the most saturated points. We're going to go ahead and reset this again. And then we have a lot more controls over here, but this is just a basic overview of the controls that you have available in Davinci Resolve. Now, one question that a lot of people have is, how do you know what your colors are doing? How do you know if you're brightening it too much or if you're darkening the image too much? That's where scopes come in. If we come over to the right, we've got this little mountain range button looking thing here. If we click that, we activate our scopes. By default, we're set to the RGB parade. This splits the image up into our red channel, our green channel, and our blue channel. We read the image from left to right within each of these channels. So we can see that there's quite a bit of green here in the mid-tones in the image. We can see that reflected in these trees. And we can see there's quite a bit of blue in the sky up here. We can see a heavy concentration of blue right here toward the top of the waveform. And then on the side here, we've got a lot more blue. This is our backpack along the side. Now, if we come down to the parade button right here and we click on waveform, this is basically just the same thing except with all three channels combined into one. This is one of the scopes that I use the most since it's easy to see the brightness and contrast within the image. So if we go ahead and brighten the image using our curves, then we can see that we're pushing all the information to the top of the waveform. Up here at 1023, that's pure white. Anything down here at 0 is pure black. So if we bring this all the way down, we're also darkening the image. So if we add more contrast, we can see we're spreading the information across this waveform, showing us that there's quite a bit of contrast in the image. I'm gonna go ahead and reset this control. Now coming over to our vector scope, this tells us the saturation of the colors within the image, and it also tells us where our colors are at. We've got our yellows, our reds, magentas, blues, cyans, and greens. We can see we've got quite a bit of yellow and red in the image, and we can see that's reflected in some of these yellow colors in the trees. We got the skin tones, and then we've got also some of these buildings and this yellow tint on the road. And then we can see we've got a little trail going off into blue. We've got some sky and this blue backpack. So we can see we've got a good representation of the colors within the image. The further out the colors reach toward the edges, the more saturated those colors are. All right, let's go ahead and switch this back to our waveform.